The crystal glasses were still ringing from a toast when Roman Whitaker laughed. He didn't lower his voice. "My wife," he said, swirling his drink, "she's nobody. Just someone who got lucky marrying into the Whitaker name." A few guests chuckled. Others looked away. Sasha Northrop sat quietly beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm enough to be mistaken for indifference. No one at the table defended her. No one in the room realized something far more important. The Whitaker empire was currently carrying hundreds of millions of dollars in loans, and the woman they were humiliating in public was the daughter of the woman who owned their bank. Before the story begins, take a moment and tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this travel across cities, countries, and time zones. And if you believe dignity matters more than status, consider subscribing to the channel. Because some stories don't begin with revenge. They begin with silence. 3 years earlier, when Sasha Northrop first met Roman Whitaker, the people around them had noticed something unusual before either of them did. It wasn't romance. It was contrast. Roman Whitaker had always entered rooms like a man who expected them to belong to him. He was tall, articulate, impeccably dressed, and carried the relaxed confidence of someone who had never once doubted his place in the world. The Whitaker name opened doors across Chicago banking circles, real estate boards, private clubs, charity galas. Roman had grown up surrounded by quiet assurances that he was meant to inherit something large. Sasha Northrop, on the other hand, rarely drew attention when she entered a room. Not because she lacked presence, but because she never tried to claim it. She dressed simply, neutral colors, clean lines, nothing extravagant. She listened more than she spoke. When conversations turned competitive, as they often did around ambitious people, Sasha had a habit of leaning back slightly, observing. People who underestimated her usually felt comfortable very quickly, and Sasha had long ago learned that comfort made people honest. They met at a mutual friends' engagement dinner in downtown Chicago. Roman had been sitting across the table from her, amused by the way she quietly dismantled a complicated argument about housing policy with 3 calm sentences. He asked where she worked. Sasha had answered honestly, "I help with research projects." That was technically true. She did help with research projects, just not in the way most people assumed. Roman liked the answer because it sounded modest, approachable, safe. In the weeks that followed, he pursued her with the easy determination of someone accustomed to success. Expensive restaurants, weekend trips, invitations to events where the Whitaker name carried weight. Sasha accepted most invitations with polite curiosity. The narrator already knows something Roman did not. From the beginning, Sasha had understood exactly who Roman Whitaker was, and exactly what kind of family he came from. Whitaker Commercial Holdings was not subtle about its presence in Chicago. The company name appeared on commercial towers, mixed-use developments, and luxury retail properties across the city's financial district. Roman's father, William Whitaker, had built the empire over 40 years through aggressive real estate acquisitions and carefully structured debt. It was a respected name, a powerful one, but it was also a company that relied heavily on bank financing. Sasha knew that detail long before she met Roman. Still, none of that was why she agreed to marry him. For the first year of their relationship, Roman had been different from the man who would one day raise a glass and call her nobody. He was attentive, curious, slightly fascinated by Sasha's calm way of thinking through problems. He told friends she was refreshingly grounded. And Sasha, though she never rushed into emotional declarations, seemed quietly content. The wedding took place on a clear spring afternoon in a historic chapel near Lake Michigan. The guest list included city council members, developers, investment partners, and several bankers who had worked with the Whitaker family for years. Sasha's side of the guest list was smaller, a handful of friends, a few colleagues, and one elegant woman sitting quietly in the second row, Eleanor Northrop. Roman met her only briefly that day. She was polite, reserved, and left the reception early due to what Sasha described as a board meeting in the morning. Roman assumed she was involved in consulting or finance. He never asked many follow-up questions. Sasha had a way of answering questions clearly, without inviting further ones. And Roman, at the time, didn't feel the need to investigate further. The first year of marriage passed smoothly. They moved into a high-rise condominium overlooking the Chicago River, an apartment Roman's family company technically owned. Roman worked long hours at Whitaker Commercial Holdings, gradually preparing to take on more executive responsibilities. Sasha maintained her quiet routines: reading, research work, occasional consulting projects that required long hours at home. When Roman's colleagues asked about her background, he usually answered with a casual shrug. "She's not really into business," he would say. Sasha never corrected him, not because the statement was accurate, but because the assumption was useful. It simplified things. The second year of their marriage was when the subtle shifts began. Not dramatic changes, nothing that would have alarmed an outside observer. But patterns rarely announce themselves loudly. They accumulate. The Whitaker family held frequent gatherings, holiday dinners, charity planning meetings, private celebrations at the Metropolitan Business Club. Sasha attended them all. Caroline Whitaker, Roman's mother, was a woman who had spent decades mastering the social architecture of powerful families. She noticed everything. And what she noticed about Sasha troubled her. Sasha didn't compete for attention. She didn't name drop. She didn't display visible ambition in the ways Caroline understood. At first, Caroline tried to help, or what she believed was helping. Small corrections. Sasha's sweetheart Chicago charity galas are usually black tie. That dress is a bit understated. Or you should speak more at these events. People might assume you're shy. Sasha would nod politely. Sometimes she adjusted. Sometimes she didn't. Roman's younger brother, Daniel Whitaker, was less diplomatic. Daniel worked in acquisitions for the family company and possessed a sharper, more impatient personality. He referred to Sasha as the quiet one. At dinners, he occasionally asked questions, with a faint smirk. "So, Sasha, what exactly do you research again?" Sasha would answer calmly. "Mostly financial behavior." Daniel once laughed at that. "Sounds thrilling." Sasha only smiled. What Daniel never noticed was that Sasha had begun carrying a small leather notebook during family gatherings. She rarely wrote in it while others were watching. But when conversations ended or guests stepped away, she sometimes added short notes. Dates, names, topics discussed. None of it looked suspicious. People often kept notebooks, but Sasha's notes were not casual observations. They were records. Because by the third year of the marriage, something else had started to change. Whitaker Commercial Holdings had several large development projects underway. Hotels, retail complexes, office renovations. Each of those projects required financing structures involving multiple banks and refinancing timelines. At first, Roman only mentioned the projects in passing. But gradually the tone shifted. Phone calls at night, conversations with his father that ended with heavy silence. Sasha noticed the pattern before Roman said anything directly. She noticed the spreadsheets he left open on his laptop. She noticed the way he stared longer than usual at certain emails. And she noticed one name appearing repeatedly in the financial documents: NorthBridge Federal Bank. The narrator already understands why that detail matters. But Roman Whitaker did not. To him, NorthBridge was simply one of the regional banks that financed many of the Whitaker developments. Reliable, professional, large enough to handle complex loans, but still regional enough to maintain personal relationships. William Whitaker had always spoken confidently about their relationship with the bank. "We've worked with them for years," he told Roman once during a dinner meeting. "They understand our business." Roman believed him. Sasha said nothing. She simply continued listening, observing, and occasionally, when no one was paying attention, writing another quiet line into the small notebook she carried. because Sasha Northrop had long ago learned something many powerful families forget. The most important leverage in a room is often invisible, and the people who possess it rarely feel the need to announce it. Long before Roman Whitaker ever met Sasha Northrop, the Whitaker name had already been carefully engineered to sound permanent. William Whitaker liked to tell people the story of how it began. He usually told it at dinners where younger investors or city officials were present, rooms filled with people who admired ambition but had never personally watched the slow machinery of wealth building. According to William, everything started with a single office building on the north side of Chicago nearly 40 years earlier. It had been old, poorly managed, and barely profitable. But William Whitaker had seen potential. He renovated the building, refinanced it, and sold it for a profit that allowed him to purchase 2 more properties. Then 5. Then 12. Within a decade, Whitaker Commercial Holdings had become a recognizable force in the city's commercial real estate market. William built his reputation on a specific philosophy. Ownership creates power, he often said. But what he rarely mentioned in those stories was the second half of that equation. Ownership required capital. And capital usually came from banks. The Whitaker empire, impressive as it looked from the outside, had been built on a sophisticated web of loans, refinancing agreements, and long-term credit relationships. Banks trusted William because he delivered returns. William trusted banks because they made expansion possible. It was a balance, one that required constant maintenance. Roman had grown up inside that balance without fully understanding it. As a child, he remembered construction site visits with his father. Hard hats, the smell of concrete dust. Men shaking William's hand with the cautious respect given to someone who controlled large amounts of money. But Roman never saw the meetings that happened later. The ones in glass conference rooms where lenders asked quiet questions about debt ratios and market exposure. By the time Roman joined Whitaker Commercial Holdings after business school, the company already controlled dozens of commercial properties across the Midwest. On paper, the empire looked enormous. Hotels in downtown districts, retail centers in suburban markets, corporate office buildings leased to law firms, accounting companies, and tech startups. But internally, the financial structure was more delicate than outsiders realized. Real estate on that scale rarely operated on pure ownership. Most of it was leveraged. Loans structured across multiple banks. Credit lines used to bridge construction periods. Refinancing cycles carefully timed to market conditions. It worked as long as property values continued rising, and banks remained cooperative. William Whitaker had spent 4 decades maintaining that cooperation, and he expected his sons to do the same. Roman understood the expectation. He simply believed the process would always work the way it had before. Daniel Whitaker, Roman's younger brother, approached the business differently. Daniel had grown up watching the same empire, but developed a sharper appetite for risk. He specialized in acquisitions, identifying distressed properties, and convincing lenders to finance rapid redevelopment. He was brilliant in short bursts, impatient with caution. William often relied on Roman to balance that temperament. Roman sees the long picture, William once told an investor. What William meant was that Roman understood how to maintain relationships, especially with lenders. Sasha observed all of this quietly during the first 2 years of her marriage. Family dinners at the Whitaker estate often turned into informal business discussions. William would spread architectural plans across the dining table. Daniel would describe potential acquisitions. Roman would explain how financing structures might support expansion. Caroline Whitaker usually listened with polite detachment. Her interests focused more on social reputation than financial engineering. Sasha never interrupted these conversations. She rarely asked questions, but she paid attention. Because the narrator knows something Sasha recognized long before the Whitakers themselves did. The structure William Whitaker had built was powerful, but it was also vulnerable. Real estate empires often look like solid towers from the outside. Inside, they are closer to carefully balanced systems of credit. Remove enough support from the banking side, and the tower doesn't fall immediately. It simply begins to shift, slowly, almost invisibly. until the weight becomes impossible to hold. The first subtle signs of pressure appeared during Roman's third year working full-time in the company. A large mixed-use development on the outskirts of Chicago had experienced unexpected delays. Construction costs rose. Retail tenants hesitated. Interest rates shifted in ways the company's earlier projections had not anticipated. Individually, none of those problems would have been catastrophic. But together, they created tension inside Whitaker Commercial Holdings. Roman noticed the change in his father first. William Whitaker had always been controlled, precise. But during several meetings, Roman observed the older man studying financial projections longer than usual. Not panic, just calculation. At one dinner meeting in the Whitaker home office, William leaned back in his chair and spoke carefully. "We'll need to accelerate the refinancing timeline on several properties." Daniel shrugged. "That's easy. Banks are still lending." William's expression didn't fully agree. "Banks are lending," he said. "But they're asking more questions." Roman understood the implication. When lenders began asking more questions, it meant risk assessments were changing. It meant financial relationships that had once operated on trust might require additional scrutiny, which meant the company's largest credit partners suddenly mattered even more. One name appeared repeatedly during those discussions: NorthBridge Federal Bank. Whitaker Commercial Holdings had several significant loan agreements with NorthBridge: construction financing, bridge loans, long-term refinancing structures tied to multiple properties. For years, the relationship had been smooth. NorthBridge was known for careful but consistent lending to large commercial developers. William trusted them. Roman assumed the trust would continue. One evening, after a particularly long meeting with his father, and Daniel Roman returned to the condominium he shared with Sasha. She was sitting near the living room window, reading. Chicago's skyline reflected across the glass behind her. Roman loosened his tie and dropped into the chair across from her. "Ever hear of NorthBridge Federal?" he asked. Sasha closed her book slowly. "Yes," she said. Roman continued talking, unaware of the quiet precision in her answer. "They're reviewing some of our refinancing timelines. Nothing serious, just standard process." Sasha nodded. "That makes sense." Roman sighed. Banks love their standard processes. He spoke casually, but the narrator understands something Roman still didn't. For the Whitaker Empire, NorthBridge Federal Bank was not just another financial partner. It was one of the structural pillars supporting their largest developments. And the institution behind that bank had been built by someone Roman had already met. Briefly, politely, on the day of his wedding. At that time, Eleanor Northrop had sat quietly in the second row of the chapel and left before the reception ended. Roman had assumed she was simply a reserved relative of Sasha's. He remembered very little about her, which, as the narrator already knows, would soon become one of the most significant oversights of Roman Whitaker's life. Meanwhile, Sasha Northrop returned to her book by the window. She listened to Roman continue describing loan terms and project timelines. Occasionally, she nodded. Occasionally, she asked a small neutral question. But she did not reveal what she already understood, not yet. Because Sasha had learned something else growing up. Information is most powerful when people reveal themselves before they realize they are being observed. And the Whitaker family, confident in their reputation, comfortable in their assumptions, had not yet finished revealing themselves. Not even close. Humiliation rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. More often it grows quietly through a pattern of small corrections, subtle exclusions, and casual remarks that are easy for everyone else to dismiss. Sasha Northrop noticed the pattern long before anyone in the Whitaker family realized it existed. The first signs had appeared shortly after the wedding. Caroline Whitaker had invited Sasha to lunch at a quiet restaurant overlooking Lakeshore Drive. It was the kind of place where waiters knew regular guests by name and spoke softly as they refilled glasses. Caroline believed in first impressions. She also believed in social calibration. Sasha Caroline said pleasantly as they reviewed the menu, The Whitaker family attends many events where presentation matters. Sasha nodded. I understand. Caroline smiled, though the expression never quite reached her eyes. You're naturally very understated. That can be charming in private settings, but in certain circles, people may misinterpret it. Sasha waited. Caroline gestured lightly towards Sasha's blouse. For example, something slightly more formal would help at charity galas. Nothing extravagant, just more appropriate. It sounded helpful, advisory. But the narrator already knows the difference between guidance and quiet correction. Sasha accepted the suggestion politely. I'll keep that in mind. And she did. At the next charity dinner, she wore a darker, more formal dress. Caroline approved with a satisfied nod. But the adjustments never quite ended. There was always another small improvement to suggest, another gentle reminder of expectations, another subtle implication that Sasha's instincts required refinement. Roman rarely noticed these exchanges, or if he did, he interpreted them differently. Mom's just trying to help, he told Sasha once after a family gathering. I know, Sasha replied. Her tone carried no argument, but she continued observing. Because the corrections from Caroline were only one part of the pattern. Daniel Whitaker provided another. Daniel possessed a sharper personality than his older brother. Where Roman relied on charm, Daniel preferred blunt confidence. He enjoyed testing people, especially those he believed were outside his family's professional world. At one Sunday dinner at the Whitaker estate, Daniel leaned back in his chair and asked Sasha a question across the table. So Sasha, Roman says you work on research projects. Sasha set down her fork. Yes. What kind of research? Mostly financial behavior and institutional decision-making. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That sounds theoretical. It can be. Daniel laughed lightly. You should come by the office sometime. Real estate deals are much more interesting than research papers. Several people at the table smiled politely. Roman said nothing. Sasha only nodded. Perhaps. She did not explain that she had already studied more complex financial structures than most of the acquisitions Daniel handled. And she certainly did not explain that she had spent years listening to conversations about institutional lending policies that shaped entire development markets. Because Sasha understood something Daniel did not. Confidence often reveals more about the speaker than the subject being discussed. After dinner that evening, Sasha added a brief note in the small leather notebook she had begun carrying months earlier. The notebook itself was discreet. Soft brown leather, no markings on the cover. Inside were neat lines of handwriting, dates, locations, topics, occasional direct quotes. Sasha never hid the notebook, but she also never explained its purpose. Roman once asked about it casually. You're always writing something down. Sasha smiled slightly. It helps me remember details. Roman accepted the explanation. Details had never been his primary concern. His attention remained focused on Whitaker Commercial Holdings and the increasing pressures within the company's expansion projects. But while Roman concentrated on financial projections, Sasha continued observing family dynamics. And the subtle humiliations continued. At a networking event hosted by a Chicago Development Association, Roman introduced Sasha to a group of investors. This is my wife, Sasha, he said warmly. She prefers to stay out of business matters. The investors nodded politely. Sasha did not correct the statement. Technically, Roman had not asked whether she preferred to stay out of business discussions. He had simply assumed it. Sasha had learned long ago that assumptions reveal more than questions. Later that evening, one of the investors approached Roman privately. Your wife seems very quiet, the man remarked. Roman laughed. Yeah, she's not really part of the industry. The narrator knows something Roman did not. Several minutes earlier, Sasha had quietly asked another guest about a refinancing structure used in a recent hotel acquisition. Her questions had been precise, technical. The guest, a mid-level executive from a lending institution, had looked slightly surprised by her understanding. But Sasha had already moved on before the conversation attracted attention. Because Sasha Northrop never sought recognition. Recognition invites scrutiny. Scrutiny complicates observation. And Sasha preferred observing. Meanwhile, the Whitaker family continued assuming they understood her. Caroline saw Sasha as socially unpolished but manageable. Daniel saw her as intellectually harmless. Roman saw her as supportive and undemanding. None of them realized how carefully Sasha listened during business conversations, or how precisely she tracked the recurring references to specific banks. Especially one, NorthBridge Federal Bank. The name appeared frequently during family discussions, sometimes in casual conversation, sometimes in tense exchanges between William and Roman. NorthBridge had financed several large Whitaker developments over the past decade. The relationship was considered stable, reliable. William Whitaker trusted them. But Sasha noticed something else. The tone of those conversations had changed slightly in recent months. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest increasing attention. One evening during dinner at the Whitaker estate, William mentioned the bank directly. "We'll be meeting with NorthBridge executives next quarter," he said. "We want to ensure the refinancing process stays smooth." Daniel shrugged. "They've worked with us for years." William nodded. "Yes, but markets shift." Roman added confidently, "Our relationship with them is strong." Across the table, Sasha quietly lifted her glass of water. She did not comment. But later that night, when she returned to the condominium with Roman, she wrote another short line in the leather notebook. "NorthBridge increasing pressure." Roman noticed her writing again. "You're serious about remembering everything, aren't you?" he joked. Sasha closed the notebook gently. "It's a useful habit." Roman smiled. Then he moved on to another topic. He never asked why the name of a particular bank appeared several times among Sasha's quiet notes. He never wondered how familiar that bank might already be to his wife. And he certainly never imagined that the person who had built NorthBridge Federal Bank from the ground up had once spent evenings explaining lending structures to a young Sasha Northrop at the family dinner table. But those conversations had happened years earlier, and Sasha had listened carefully then, just as she listened now. Because the Whitaker family believed their greatest strength was their reputation. What they did not yet understand was that reputation is only powerful when the systems behind it remain cooperative. Banks, credit lines, financing approvals, those systems rarely operate on pride. They operate on leverage. And the quiet woman the Whitakers continued underestimating understood leverage far better than they realized. The Whitaker family rarely spoke about banks in emotional terms. To them, banks were tools. Necessary ones, certainly, but still tools. William Whitaker had spent 4 decades negotiating with lenders. To him, financial institutions were predictable machines that responded to numbers, collateral, and reputation. If a developer delivered consistent profits, banks extended credit. If a developer faltered, banks became cautious. But William had never faltered long enough to lose their confidence. That belief had become a quiet assumption inside Whitaker Commercial Holdings. The assumption that the Whitaker name itself carried weight. Roman had grown up hearing that assumption repeated in different forms. Relationships matter more than paperwork. Banks prefer stability. Once they trust you, they stay with you. For years, those statements had been mostly accurate. Whitaker Commercial Holdings maintained loan agreements with several institutions, but one name appeared more frequently than the others. NorthBridge Federal Bank. NorthBridge had financed several of the Whitaker company's largest developments during the past decade. A downtown hotel renovation, a suburban retail complex, a mixed-use office tower near the financial district. Each project involved complex loan structures, construction financing that later converted into long-term debt, bridge loans that covered unexpected delays, refinancing arrangements negotiated every few years. From the outside, the Whitaker developments looked like independent successes. Inside the financial system, many of them shared the same foundation: NorthBridge money. Roman rarely worried about that detail. Banks were partners in development. As long as projects generated revenue and property values continued rising, the relationship remained comfortable. That had always been the pattern. One evening, several months before the dinner at the Metropolitan Business Club, Roman returned home later than usual. Sasha was sitting at the kitchen counter with her laptop open. She had a habit of working in the quiet hours of the evening, when the city outside their high-rise windows softened into distant lights. Roman poured himself a drink before speaking. "Today was interesting," he said. Sasha glanced up. Busy Roman leaned against the counter. "Dad had a meeting with our financing team. We're restructuring the timeline for the Westgate project." Sasha closed her laptop halfway. "What kind of restructuring?" Roman sighed. "Nothing dramatic. Construction costs jumped again. And the leasing schedule is slower than expected, so we're pushing part of the debt into a new refinancing package." Sasha nodded slowly. "And NorthBridge is involved in that." Roman paused. Then he smiled slightly. "You really do remember everything." Sasha didn't answer. Roman continued talking. "They're reviewing the numbers. Standard procedure. We've worked with them for years." His tone carried the easy confidence of someone repeating a familiar line. Standard procedure. Sasha had heard those words before. Many times. Not from developers, from bankers. Because in banking language, standard procedure rarely meant something simple. It meant analysis, risk review, exposure calculations, processes that could either reaffirm a partnership or quietly tighten it. But Sasha only said, "That sounds reasonable." Roman took a sip of his drink. "I swear sometimes it feels like half my job is reassuring lenders." Sasha tilted her head slightly. "Do you find that difficult?" Roman shrugged. "Not really. Whitaker projects have a strong track record. Banks like stability." Sasha nodded again. She had grown up hearing that word often. Stability. Her mother used it differently. Sasha Northrop had always described stability as something banks studied, not something they assumed. But Sasha did not repeat those lessons now. Instead, she asked a neutral question. "How large is the refinancing package?" Roman hesitated. "About 200 million. He said the number casually, but it lingered in the air for a moment. $200 million was not unusual in commercial development. But it was still a number that required institutional confidence. Sasha folded her hands together. "And NorthBridge holds most of that exposure?" Roman nodded. "They're leading the package." Then he waved the topic away. "Anyway, it'll work out. Dad's been working with them forever." Sasha allowed the conversation to drift toward easier subjects. But later that night, after Roman had gone to bed, she opened her laptop again. Her screen displayed a series of financial news articles, market analyses, regional banking reports, and a quiet internal memorandum she had received earlier that week. NorthBridge Federal Bank had been expanding its commercial lending portfolio over the past decade. Carefully, strategically. But the bank had also increased its oversight of large real estate loans in the previous year. Sasha read through several paragraphs slowly. Then she closed the document and reached for the leather notebook. The notebook now contained months of observations, family conversations, project names, loan references. Tonight she added another short entry. Westgate refinancing approx. $200 million NorthBridge lead. She closed the notebook gently. From the living room window, the Chicago skyline shimmered across the river. Sasha watched the lights for a long moment. Because the narrator understands something that the Whitaker family still did not. NorthBridge Federal Bank was not just another regional lender. It was a financial institution built over decades by a woman who understood leverage in ways most developers never considered. Eleanor Northrop had started the bank with a modest group of investors 30 years earlier. At the time, Chicago's financial landscape had been dominated by much larger institutions. But Eleanor believed there was space for a different model. A bank that specialized in disciplined commercial lending, careful growth, and quiet influence. Over time, NorthBridge expanded. not through loud acquisitions or aggressive publicity, but through steady reputation. Developers who needed reliable financing began turning to them. And banks that survived decades without scandals gradually earned something more valuable than attention. They earned trust. By the time Sasha reached adulthood, NorthBridge had become one of the most respected regional commercial lenders in the Midwest. Sasha had spent many evenings listening to conversations about credit policy, loan committees, and regulatory oversight. Not because she intended to run the bank one day, but because Eleanor believed understanding finance was a form of literacy. You don't need to work in banking to benefit from understanding how money moves. Her mother once told her. Sasha had remembered that lesson. Years later, she was now sitting quietly inside a family whose business empire depended on that same movement of money. And the Whitakers did not yet realize how closely their projects intersected with the institution her mother controlled. Not because the information was hidden, but because they had never thought to ask the right questions. Roman had met Sasha Northrop once, briefly, at his own wedding. He remembered her as polite and distant, a quiet woman who seemed more interested in leaving early than joining the celebration. He never investigated her background. He never wondered why Sasha's last name had sounded faintly familiar to certain bankers who attended the reception. Those details had passed unnoticed. And now, months later, Roman continued moving confidently through business meetings, assuming NorthBridge Federal Bank remained exactly what it had always been to his family. A reliable partner, a predictable institution, a tool. Meanwhile, Sasha closed her notebook and turned off the kitchen light. Because the quiet truth the Whitakers had overlooked was simple. Tools only remain tools when the person holding them agrees. And the person holding the largest tool in their financial structure had a last name Roman Whitaker had already begun learning to underestimate. Northrop. Eleanor Northrop had built her reputation on two principles. The first was discipline. The second was silence. In the world of commercial banking, those two qualities were far more valuable than charisma. Eleanor understood that long before she founded NorthBridge Federal Bank. She had begun her career as a junior credit analyst at a large financial institution in Chicago nearly 4 decades earlier. At the time, commercial lending was still dominated by older banking families and institutions that treated regional development loans with a mixture of caution and hierarchy. Eleanor had entered that system as an outsider, young, methodical, and unwilling to rely on reputation alone. While others focused on networking, Eleanor studied balance sheets. While colleagues debated market trends, she examined risk exposure line by line. Within a few years, senior executives began noticing something unusual. Her loan assessments were almost always correct, not because she predicted the future, but because she refused to ignore the quiet warning signs others preferred to overlook. When a developer overstated projected revenue, Eleanor noticed. When a financing structure depended too heavily on optimistic market assumptions, Eleanor noticed. When a borrower appeared stable on the surface but carried hidden vulnerabilities, Eleanor noticed. Those habits earned her promotions. But they also revealed a deeper frustration. Large banks often moved slowly. Decisions passed through layers of committees and executives who sometimes prioritized relationships over careful analysis. Eleanor believed lending required a different balance. Trust mattered, but discipline mattered more. So 30 years earlier, she left the institution where she had built her early career and founded something new. NorthBridge Federal Bank began modestly. A small office, a handful of experienced analysts, a clear philosophy. NorthBridge would specialize in commercial lending, but with stricter internal review processes than most competitors. Developers who worked with the bank quickly learned something. NorthBridge rarely made impulsive decisions. But once they committed to financing a project, they were consistent, reliable, professional. That reliability gradually attracted larger clients. And over time, the bank grew. Not through loud expansion, but through patience. By the time Sasha Northrop reached adulthood, NorthBridge had become one of the most respected commercial lenders in the Midwest. Eleanor rarely spoke publicly about her accomplishments. She preferred quiet influence to public recognition. Sasha had grown up inside that quiet environment. Her childhood home did not resemble the flashy estates often associated with wealth. It was elegant, certainly, but simple. Bookshelves lined the study where Eleanor worked late into the evening. Financial reports often lay open across the desk. As a child, Sasha sometimes sat nearby reading while her mother reviewed loan documents. Eventually, Sasha began asking questions. "What makes a loan safe?" she asked once. Eleanor closed the report she had been studying. "A loan is never completely safe," she replied. "It's about understanding risk." Sasha considered that. "How do you understand risk?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "You listen carefully to what people say, and you pay even closer attention to what they avoid saying." That lesson stayed with Sasha long after she left home. Years later, sitting quietly inside the Whitaker family's gatherings, she applied the same principle. Listening, observing, understanding what was spoken and what was left unsaid. Sasha's relationship with her mother remained steady, even after she moved to Chicago for work and eventually married Roman Whitaker. They spoke regularly, but their conversations were rarely dramatic. Eleanor never interfered in Sasha's personal life, and Sasha never exaggerated details about her marriage. One evening, several weeks before the dinner that would later change everything, Sasha called her mother after returning from a Whitaker family gathering. Eleanor answered on the second ring. "How are you, Sasha? I'm well." There was a brief pause. Then Eleanor asked a question she often asked. "How is your husband?" Sasha considered the question carefully. "Roman is ambitious," she said. Eleanor understood the tone. Ambition was not inherently negative, but it required discipline to remain constructive. "And the family business?" Eleanor asked. "They are expanding several developments. Real estate is sensitive to market shifts." "Yes." Another pause followed. Then Sasha added quietly, "They work closely with NorthBridge." Eleanor did not sound surprised. Many developers do. Sasha waited. Then she said something slightly more specific. "There's a refinancing discussion involving one of their larger projects." Eleanor did not immediately respond. Instead, she asked a question. "Are you comfortable in this situation?" Sasha understood the meaning behind those words. Her mother was not asking about finances. She was asking about respect. Sasha answered honestly, "I'm observing." Eleanor accepted that answer. She had raised Sasha to trust her own judgment. "Observation is valuable," Eleanor said. "But remember that silence is not the same as acceptance." "I know." They spoke for several more minutes about ordinary subjects before ending the call. Neither woman mentioned the Whitaker family again during that conversation. Because Eleanor Northrop believed in a principle that had guided her entire career: power should never be used prematurely, and Sasha had inherited that discipline. Meanwhile, across the city, the Whitaker family continued their routines without realizing how closely their financial world intersected with Sasha's personal one. William Whitaker still believed NorthBridge Federal Bank was simply one of several lending partners supporting his developments. Roman still assumed the bank would treat the Whitaker name with automatic respect. Daniel still believed aggressive expansion would always attract financing. None of them understood how the bank actually operated. NorthBridge did not lend money based on reputation alone. They studied exposure, risk concentration, market volatility, and borrower behavior, especially borrower behavior. The narrator already knows something Eleanor Northrop would soon learn. And when she did, she would not respond emotionally. She would respond professionally, because bankers rarely retaliate. They review. And sometimes, after careful review, they simply decide that certain financial relationships require closer examination. That decision, when it arrives, rarely feels dramatic. It arrives in the form of quiet emails, scheduled meetings, requests for documentation. But those quiet processes can reshape entire business empires. Sasha Northrop understood that, which was why she continued sitting quietly at Whitaker dinners, listening to conversations about loans and refinancing timelines. She asked few questions. She made no accusations. She simply watched. Because the Whitaker family still believed Sasha was an ordinary woman who had married into wealth. And Sasha had no intention of correcting them. Not yet. Pressure does not always arrive with alarms. Sometimes it appears first in the tone of ordinary conversations. Roman Whitaker began noticing it during the early weeks of autumn. At Whitaker Commercial Holdings, the office usually carried the steady rhythm of an established company phones ringing assistants, coordinating meetings analysts, reviewing development projections. The business had operated this way for years, and most employees moved through the building with practiced confidence. But subtle changes had begun to surface. Meetings lasted longer, financial reports circulated more frequently, and William Whitaker spent more time behind closed doors with the company's senior financial team. Roman first sensed the shift during a Monday morning strategy meeting. The conference room overlooked downtown Chicago, its glass walls reflecting the skyline like a silent audience. Roman, Daniel, and several department heads sat around the long table while William reviewed a projection on the screen. The slide displayed the timeline for the Westgate development. Westgate was one of Whitaker Commercial Holdings' most ambitious projects, in years a mixed-use complex combining retail space, residential towers, and a boutique hotel. The scale of the project required a complex financial structure. Construction loans, bridge financing, future refinancing tied to projected occupancy rates. For the first 2 years, everything had progressed according to plan. But markets had begun shifting. Construction costs rose faster than expected. Several retail tenants delayed lease agreements, and interest rates had climbed gradually over the previous year. Individually, none of these factors would destroy a project. Together, they created pressure. William stood at the front of the room, studying the financial model. "We'll need to restructure part of the financing schedule," he said calmly. Daniel leaned forward. Meaning what exactly? William clicked to another slide. The original refinancing window assumed full retail occupancy by Q3. That's no longer realistic. Roman scanned the numbers, so we pushed the timeline. Partially, William said, but we'll also need to renegotiate some terms with the primary lender. Daniel folded his arms. NorthBridge, William nodded. They hold the largest portion of the construction debt. Roman felt the familiar tension that accompanied lender negotiations. Banks rarely panicked over temporary project delays, but they also disliked uncertainty. "Have they raised concerns yet?" Roman asked. William shook his head. Not formally. The word formally hung in the room. Everyone understood its meaning. Concerns could exist long before they became official. Daniel broke the silence. "They've worked with us for years. This won't be a problem." William did not immediately respond. He studied the projection again. "Relationships help," he said eventually. "But banks respond to numbers." Roman understood that logic. Still, he shared Daniel's confidence. Whitaker Commercial Holdings had delivered profitable developments for decades. NorthBridge Federal Bank had financed several of those projects. Why would this situation be different later that evening? Roman returned home with the lingering weight of the meeting still on his mind. Sasha was in the living room, reading the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the quiet space. She looked up when he entered. "You seem tired." Roman loosened his tie. "Long day." He walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water before returning to the sofa. Sasha closed her book. "Something at work." Roman hesitated. He did not usually discuss internal business matters in detail. But Sasha had a calming presence that made conversation easy. "The Westgate project is getting complicated," he said. Sasha waited. Roman continued. "The refinancing timeline needs adjustment, and the bank NorthBridge is reviewing the numbers." Sasha's expression remained calm. "That's normal?" Roman nodded. "Yeah, Dad says it's standard procedure." He leaned back against the sofa. "But there's more pressure than usual." Sasha watched him carefully. From the bank, not exactly, Roman said. More from the market. Interest rates are moving, and lenders everywhere are tightening their reviews. Sasha absorbed the information quietly. She'd already anticipated much of it, because earlier that week she'd read several financial briefings discussing regional lending trends. Banks were becoming more cautious with large commercial projects, especially developments that depended heavily on projected future revenue. Westgate fit that description perfectly. But Sasha did not say any of this aloud. Instead, she asked a simple question. How large is NorthBridge's exposure to the project? Roman thought for a moment. About 120 million. Sasha nodded slowly. That's significant. Roman smiled faintly. You sound like one of our analysts. Habit, she replied. Roman relaxed slightly. Talking through the situation seemed to ease some of the tension. Anyway, he said we're planning a dinner with some of the bank executives next month. Sasha raised an eyebrow. A dinner private gathering. Dad's idea. Roman shrugged. Developers and bankers have been having dinners like that forever. It keeps relationships strong. Sasha considered the idea. Relationship dinners were common in the business world, but they rarely changed the underlying numbers. Still, she simply said, I'm sure it will go well. Roman smiled again. It always does. Across the room, the city lights flickered beyond the windows. Roman felt reassured by the familiar view. Chicago had been the Whitaker family's domain for decades. Developments, investments, financial partnerships. Everything seemed firmly rooted in that history. Meanwhile, Sasha quietly reached for the small leather notebook resting on the side table. Roman barely noticed as she opened it. She wrote a few brief lines. Westgate refinancing pressure increasing. NorthBridge exposure approx. $120 million. Dinner planned bank executives. She closed the notebook gently. Roman glanced over. More notes. Sasha smiled slightly. I like remembering details. Roman chuckled. You should work for our finance team. Sasha did not answer. Instead, she leaned back and looked out the window. Because the narrator understands something Roman Whitaker still did not. Banks do not evaluate risk based on dinners. They evaluate behavior, stability, patterns. And sometimes, when circumstances align in unexpected ways, they also evaluate character. The Whitaker family believed their upcoming dinner would strengthen a professional relationship. But the quiet chain of events already unfolding would soon test far more than financial projections. And Sasha Northrop was still watching, still listening, still waiting for the moment when observation would finally become action. By the time the dinner invitation was finalized, the Whitaker family had already decided what kind of evening it would be. William Whitaker believed in carefully controlled environments. If a conversation involved millions of dollars in financing, he preferred to host it somewhere familiar, somewhere designed to reinforce status and stability. The Metropolitan Business Club in downtown Chicago provided exactly that. The building stood among the city's older financial towers, quietly prestigious, its interior decorated with polished wood panels, antique lighting fixtures, and long corridors lined with portraits of former industry leaders. Membership in the club was limited, and for decades it had served as a meeting ground for Chicago's business elite. Developers, bankers, corporate attorneys, investment managers, people who negotiated large decisions in calm voices. William had reserved one of the private dining rooms, not overly large, but elegant enough to remind guests that Whitaker Commercial Holdings still commanded influence. The purpose of the dinner was not officially stated, but everyone understood it. The Whitakers wanted to reassure NorthBridge Federal Bank that the Westgate project remained stable. Roman heard about the dinner during a meeting in his father's office. William stood near the window, reviewing a printed document while Roman and Daniel sat across from his desk. I've arranged a private dinner with several representatives from NorthBridge, William said. Daniel leaned back. Trying to smooth things over, William gave him a measured look. There's nothing to smooth over. Daniel smirked slightly but said nothing. William continued. They're conducting their standard financial review. We're simply reinforcing our long-standing relationship. Roman nodded. That makes sense. William turned toward him. You'll attend, of course, and bring Sasha. Roman paused. Sasha William raised an eyebrow. She's your wife. Roman hesitated only briefly before nodding again. Of course. The conversation moved on to other topics: construction schedules, lease negotiations, financial models. But Roman's mind returned to the dinner later that evening as he drove home. He was not worried about the meeting itself. Whitaker Developments had always impressed lenders. The company had decades of profitable history. But Roman also understood the unspoken dynamics of these gatherings. Image mattered. Confidence mattered. The Whitaker name needed to appear stable, successful, composed. When he entered the condominium, Sasha was sitting at the dining table reviewing documents on her laptop. Roman dropped his briefcase beside the chair. Dad scheduled a dinner with NorthBridge executives next week. Sasha looked up calmly. At the business club, Roman blinked. Yes. How did you know Sasha closed the laptop halfway? It seems like the kind of place your father would choose. Roman smiled. That's accurate. He poured himself a drink from the small bar near the window. They want us to attend together. Sasha nodded. That's fine. Roman watched her for a moment. You'll probably meet a few senior people from the bank. Sasha's expression remained neutral. I'm sure they're interesting. Roman laughed. Bankers are rarely interesting. Sasha said nothing. The narrator already understands something Roman does not. Bankers rarely try to be interesting. They prefer being powerful. Roman walked toward the dining table. There's just one thing, he added. Sasha waited. Roman rubbed the back of his neck slightly. These dinners can get technical. Sasha tilted her head. In what way? Financial discussions, market projections, lending structures? Roman shrugged. I just don't want the evening to feel uncomfortable for you. Sasha studied him for a moment. Roman, she said gently, I can sit through a conversation about numbers. Roman smiled, slightly embarrassed. Right, of course. He paused before adding another thought. Also, Mom might expect something a little more formal in terms of appearance. Sasha glanced down at her simple sweater. I assume she will. Roman chuckled awkwardly. You know how she is. Yes, Sasha said quietly. She returned her attention to the laptop screen. Roman did not notice the small shift in her eyes. Because Sasha was not thinking about clothing. She was thinking about timing. Later that night, after Roman went to bed, Sasha reopened her laptop. The quiet apartment allowed her to focus without distraction. She opened her email. For several minutes, she stared at the blank message window. Then she began typing. The message was short, direct. There were no dramatic explanations, no emotional descriptions, just a few lines. Mother, I believe you may be attending a dinner next week with Whitaker Commercial Holdings regarding their Westgate refinancing. If that is the case, I will likely be present as well. Sasha. She reread the message once, then pressed send. Across the city, Sasha Northrop was still in her office at NorthBridge Federal Bank. It was nearly 10 o'clock in the evening. Most of the building had gone quiet, but Sasha rarely left early when major financial reviews were underway. Several loan files remained open on her desk. One of them carried a familiar name, Whitaker Commercial Holdings. Sasha had already reviewed the exposure summary earlier that afternoon. Large developments, multiple refinancing timelines, substantial credit commitments, none of it immediately alarming, but significant enough to require careful monitoring. Her computer chimed softly as Sasha's email arrived. Sasha opened the message and read it once. Her expression did not change, but she leaned back slightly in her chair. The coincidence was notable. She had not previously known that Sasha's husband worked within Whitaker Commercial Holdings. Sasha rarely discussed her personal life in detail. Sasha respected that boundary, but now the connection was impossible to ignore. She opened the loan file again. Westgate Development. NorthBridge exposure, projected refinancing review. For several minutes, Eleanor studied the numbers in silence. Then she closed the file. Her reply to Sasha was brief. Understood. We will discuss nothing personal during professional meetings. Sasha read the response several minutes later. She expected nothing else. Her mother had always maintained strict separation between personal relationships and institutional responsibilities. Sasha appreciated that discipline, because the upcoming dinner was not about family. It was about business. And in business, every participant eventually revealed something important: confidence, arrogance, respect, or the lack of it. Sasha closed her laptop and walked toward the window. Chicago's night skyline stretched across the dark river. The city looked calm, stable. Yet, beneath that quiet surface, enormous financial systems moved constantly. Loans, credit lines, investments. Every building in the skyline depended on them. And sometimes the people who believed they controlled those systems discovered they were only temporary participants. The dinner at the Metropolitan Business Club would appear ordinary to most of the guests. A developer meeting with lenders, a routine professional gathering. But Sasha already understood something the Whitaker family had not yet considered. Professional relationships rarely remain unchanged when personal truth enters the room. And the truth waiting quietly beneath the surface of that dinner would soon make itself impossible to ignore. The Metropolitan Business Club had always been designed to make power look effortless. Tall windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. Polished wood panels softened the walls, and quiet chandeliers reflected warm light across tables dressed in crisp white linen. The atmosphere was controlled, deliberate, and reassuring, exactly the environment where business leaders preferred to conduct delicate conversations. On the evening of the Whitaker dinner, the private dining room had been arranged with careful precision. William Whitaker believed presentation mattered as much as preparation. 16 seats surrounded the long table. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, and folded napkins were aligned perfectly. The staff moved silently between place settings, preparing for the arrival of guests who were accustomed to influence. Roman Whitaker stood near the entrance, adjusting his jacket when the first guests began arriving. Several of the Whitaker company's legal advisors entered first, followed by 2 senior financial consultants who frequently worked with the company's development projects. Roman greeted each of them with the practiced confidence he had learned from his father. The Whitaker name still carried authority in rooms like this. But Roman noticed something else as the evening progressed. His father seemed unusually attentive. William spoke politely to each guest, but remained watchful, occasionally checking his watch. Because the most important guests had not yet arrived. NorthBridge Federal Bank. Across the room, Sasha Northrop sat quietly in her seat beside Roman. She wore a simple, dark dress, elegant, understated, entirely appropriate for the setting. Caroline Whitaker had briefly inspected the choice earlier that evening and given a subtle nod of approval. To most people in the room, Sasha appeared exactly as she always had during Whitaker events. Reserved, quiet, uninvolved in the deeper layers of business conversation. Daniel Whitaker leaned toward Roman as another guest approached the table. Still waiting for the bankers, he muttered. Roman nodded. They said they might be slightly delayed. Daniel smirked. Typical. Roman did not respond. He was focused on maintaining the tone of the evening. Professional, relaxed, confident. The conversation gradually shifted toward development markets, investment trends, and leasing activity in the Chicago commercial district. William guided these discussions carefully, steering them toward topics that highlighted Whitaker Commercial Holdings' long track record of successful projects. Everything proceeded smoothly, until the wine arrived. Alcohol had a subtle effect on Roman Whitaker. He rarely drank excessively, but even a few glasses loosened the careful restraint he usually maintained in formal settings. The first glass disappeared during appetizers, the second during the main course. By the time the conversation turned toward family introductions, Roman's tone had grown more relaxed than usual. One of the guests, a financial consultant who had worked with Whitaker Developments for years, turned toward Sasha politely. And Sasha, he said kindly, "What line of work are you in?" Roman answered before she could speak. "She's not really in the business world," he said with a light laugh. Several guests smiled politely. Sasha remained still. Roman continued swirling the wine in his glass. She prefers quieter things. Sasha did not correct him, because the narrator already knows something important. Silence can sometimes be a form of patience. But Roman, buoyed by alcohol and the comfortable familiarity of the room, continued speaking. "My wife," he said casually, "is about as far from our industry as you can get." Daniel chuckled. "That's putting it nicely." Roman grinned. Then he leaned back in his chair and added the sentence that would later echo through every memory of the evening. "My wife," he said, lifting his glass. "She's nobody. Just someone who got lucky marrying into the Whitaker name." The sentence floated across the table like something light and harmless. But the room reacted differently. A few guests forced polite laughter. Others looked down at their plates. William Whitaker's expression hardened slightly. Caroline Whitaker did not intervene. Daniel smirked openly. Sasha Northrop remained completely still. Her hands rested lightly on the table. Her posture did not change. Her face revealed nothing. Roman, emboldened by the faint laughter, added another careless remark. "I mean, let's be honest. Without the Whitaker name, nobody in this room would even know who she is." Another brief ripple of uneasy laughter moved across the table. But several guests had stopped smiling entirely, because humiliation has a different weight when it happens in public. Sasha lifted her glass of water slowly. She took a small sip. Then she placed the glass back down and spoke in a calm voice. "I understand." 2 words, nothing more. They were not defensive, not angry, simply quiet. Roman barely noticed the subtle shift in the room. But the narrator understands something he did not. Several people had just witnessed a moment that felt deeply uncomfortable. And discomfort has a way of lingering long after laughter fades. Before anyone could change the subject, a quiet knock sounded at the door. A staff member stepped inside. "Mr. Whitaker," he said respectfully, "your guests from NorthBridge Federal Bank have arrived." William Whitaker straightened immediately. "Please show them in." Roman adjusted his jacket, unaware that the evening had already begun changing in ways he did not yet understand. The door opened. 3 individuals entered the room. 2 were familiar to Roman mid-level executives he had met during previous financial meetings. But the woman walking at the front of the group was someone he did not recognize. She moved with calm authority, her posture straight, her expression composed. Her presence carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to rooms like this. William stepped forward. "Welcome," he said warmly. "We're pleased you could join us." The woman offered a polite nod. "Thank you for the invitation." Her voice was steady, professional. Roman watched the exchange with polite curiosity. Across the table, Sasha Northrop lifted her eyes. For the first time that evening, her expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough for the narrator to recognize something important. Recognition. Because the woman standing beside William Whitaker was not simply a representative from NorthBridge Federal Bank. She was Eleanor Northrop, founder, majority owner, and Sasha's mother. But no one else in the room understood that yet. Not William, not Roman, not Daniel. The Whitaker family still believed this evening was about reassuring a bank. They had not yet realized that the most powerful person connected to that bank had just entered the room, and that the quiet woman they had spent the evening underestimating had already seen her. When Eleanor Northrop entered a room, she rarely needed to announce who she was. People who worked in finance often recognized her immediately, not because she sought attention, but because influence leaves subtle traces, industry articles, conference panels, policy discussions, decisions that shape entire lending markets. To those familiar with commercial banking, Eleanor Northrop was one of those quiet forces. But to the Whitaker family, she appeared simply as a senior representative of NorthBridge Federal Bank. William Whitaker stepped forward with his usual professional warmth. "Miss Northrop, welcome. We're very pleased you could join us this evening. Eleanor offered a calm handshake. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. I appreciate the invitation. Her tone was polite, neutral, and entirely professional. Behind her stood two other executives from NorthBridge senior loan officers who had worked with Whitaker Commercial Holdings on previous projects. William gestured toward the table. Please join us. The room shifted slightly as chairs moved and guests adjusted their seats. Roman Whitaker rose to greet the bankers as they approached. He had met the two loan officers before exchanging the brief formalities typical in financial negotiations. But Eleanor Northrop was unfamiliar. Roman extended his hand. Roman Whitaker, he said confidently. Eleanor shook his hand. A pleasure. There was no visible reaction in her expression. No recognition. No hint that she'd seen Roman once before, at his wedding. Across the table, Sasha Northrop watched the moment in silence. Her posture remained unchanged. Her hands rested lightly beside her glass. Only the narrator noticed the small detail others missed. Sasha's eyes softened slightly when Eleanor entered the room. But she did not stand. She did not speak. Because the rules her mother lived by were clear. Professional environments required professional boundaries. William Whitaker resumed his seat at the head of the table. We're grateful you could attend on short notice, he said. Eleanor nodded politely. NorthBridge values long-standing partnerships. The words were carefully chosen. Neutral, neither overly warm nor distant. Roman leaned forward slightly. We've always appreciated the bank's support for our developments, Daniel added casually, especially on projects like Westgate. At the mention of the project, one of the loan officers exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor. It lasted only a second. But Sasha noticed, because Sasha had learned from her mother how bankers listened, carefully, without revealing their conclusions too early. Dinner resumed. Conversations turned toward market conditions, leasing trends, and the economic outlook for commercial real estate. William Whitaker guided the discussion with the practiced confidence of someone who had spent decades negotiating financial relationships. The Chicago market remains strong, he said. Retail demand is stabilizing, and office occupancy is improving. One of the loan officers nodded thoughtfully. That's consistent with the data we've seen. Roman joined the conversation with increasing enthusiasm. We're especially optimistic about the Westgate development once the retail components are fully leased. Eleanor listened quietly. She did not interrupt. Occasionally, she asked short, precise questions. Have the remaining retail spaces secured letters of intent? Roman answered confidently. Negotiations are ongoing. And the revised refinancing timeline? Eleanor asked. Roman glanced briefly toward his father before responding. We're adjusting projections to align with the updated occupancy schedule. Eleanor nodded once. Her expression remained calm, but she made no further comment. Across the table, Sasha watched the exchange with quiet attention. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes. On the surface, it appeared cordial, professional, exactly the kind of discussion developers expected during meetings with lenders. But small signals had begun appearing beneath the surface. Questions that lingered slightly longer. Responses that required careful phrasing. The rhythm of negotiation. Meanwhile, Roman poured himself another glass of wine. His earlier confidence had not faded. If anything, the presence of the bank executives reinforced his belief that the evening was going well. Because Roman still believed the purpose of the dinner was reassurance. He had not yet realized that bankers rarely attend dinners simply to be reassured. They attend to observe. At one point, William turned the conversation toward introductions. I realize we've spoken about business all evening, he said, but we should properly introduce everyone. He gestured around the table, briefly naming the Whitaker Company's advisors and guests. When he reached Sasha, he paused slightly. And this is Sasha, Roman's wife. Sasha inclined her head politely. Eleanor's eyes shifted toward her. For a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow. Mother and daughter looked at each other across the table. The exchange lasted no more than 2 seconds. But within that silence passed a quiet understanding. Eleanor saw that Sasha had chosen not to reveal their connection. Sasha saw that Eleanor would respect that choice. The rules of professional distance remained intact. William continued speaking. "Sasha keeps Roman grounded," he added with a faint chuckle. Daniel smirked. "That's one way to put it." Several guests laughed lightly. Roman lifted his glass again. "Sasha prefers staying out of business matters," he said casually. Eleanor did not react. But Sasha noticed something else. The two NorthBridge loan officers had grown noticeably attentive. They were studying the room carefully because they had heard Roman's earlier remarks before the bankers entered. About Sasha being nobody, about her luck in marrying into the Whitaker name. And now, they had just watched Eleanor Northrop look directly at that same woman with quiet recognition. The connection had not yet been spoken aloud, but the tension had already begun forming. William Whitaker leaned slightly forward. "Perhaps after dinner we can briefly review the refinancing schedule for Westgate," he suggested. Eleanor nodded. That would be appropriate. Roman smiled. Excellent. He believed the evening was proceeding exactly as planned, because Roman still did not know the truth sitting quietly beside him, or the significance of the woman now seated across the table. But that truth was approaching the surface. And when it emerged, the atmosphere in the room would change in ways no one at the Whitaker table had prepared for. Sasha Northrop sat calmly in her chair, her hands folded lightly, her expression composed. She had listened to every word spoken that evening, and she knew the moment of recognition was coming, not through anger, not through confrontation, but through a simple truth spoken at exactly the right time. The conversation around the table continued with careful professionalism. To anyone observing from outside the room, the evening would have appeared entirely normal. Developers discussing timelines, bankers asking questions, wine glasses being refilled, the quiet clink of silverware. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Eleanor Northrop listened with the same composed attention she brought to every financial review. Her posture remained straight, her tone measured, her expressions controlled. Yet the moment she had looked across the table and seen Sasha had altered the entire context of the evening. Not emotionally, professionally. Because Eleanor understood two things immediately. First, the Whitaker family had no idea who Sasha truly was. Second, Sasha had deliberately chosen not to reveal that information. That meant Eleanor would follow the same discipline she had always practiced in business. She would wait. Across the table, Sasha sat quietly beside Roman, watching the discussion move toward the subject everyone knew would eventually dominate the evening. Westgate. William Whitaker cleared his throat. "Since we're already discussing market conditions," he said, "perhaps it would be helpful to review the updated timeline for the Westgate refinancing." One of the NorthBridge loan officers nodded. "That would be useful." William gestured toward Roman. "Roman has been coordinating most of the financial projections." Roman straightened slightly in his chair. This was familiar territory. He had spent weeks reviewing those projections. Confident numbers, adjusted timelines, reasonable explanations for the construction delays. He began speaking with the ease of someone accustomed to presenting complex information. "As you know," Roman said, "the Westgate development remains structurally sound. The construction delays we experienced earlier this year have largely stabilized." He glanced toward the loan officers. "The remaining retail spaces are in negotiation, and we expect occupancy to increase significantly over the next 2 quarters. One of the bankers asked a question, and the hotel component Roman responded smoothly. "The management agreement is finalized. Renovations are progressing as scheduled." The banker nodded thoughtfully. Across the table, Eleanor watched the exchange without interrupting. She had already reviewed the loan file. She knew the numbers. But she also knew something Roman did not. Numbers only tell part of the story. Behavior reveals the rest. Roman continued explaining the refinancing proposal. The revised structure simply shifts part of the debt maturity timeline to allow the retail leases to finalize before refinancing. Daniel leaned forward. It's a straightforward adjustment, he added confidently. William nodded. Our company has handled projects of this scale for decades. The implication was clear. Trust the Whitaker name. Trust the track record. Trust the relationship. For a moment, the room grew quiet. Then Eleanor Northrop spoke. Her voice was calm. Mr. Whitaker, she said, addressing Roman, may I ask a question about your projected occupancy timeline? Roman nodded immediately. Of course. Eleanor folded her hands lightly on the table. Your projections assume retail occupancy will reach 85% within the next 12 months. Roman glanced briefly at his notes. That's correct. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. What percentage is currently secured through signed lease agreements? Roman paused. Approximately 45%. And the remaining 40% is based on ongoing negotiations, yes. Eleanor nodded slowly. That is helpful. Her tone remained neutral, but the question had quietly introduced something important into the room. William Whitaker leaned forward slightly. We're confident those leases will finalize soon, he said. Eleanor met his gaze. I appreciate that confidence. Another pause followed. Then she added something that shifted the tone of the discussion. NorthBridge always values long-standing partnerships. However, we are currently reviewing our exposure levels in several large development projects. The words were polite, professional, but everyone at the table understood their meaning. The bank was reassessing risk. Roman responded quickly. We understand the need for review. Daniel nodded. Of course. But Sasha noticed something subtle. The loan officers were no longer simply listening. They were studying the Whitaker family carefully, and Eleanor's eyes had returned briefly to Sasha. The moment lingered only a second. Then William Whitaker spoke again. Perhaps we should move forward with the documentation review after dinner. Eleanor inclined her head. That would be appropriate. Roman leaned back slightly, attempting to ease the atmosphere. These processes always sound more dramatic than they are, he said lightly. Banks have procedures. Developers have projects. Eventually everything aligns. Daniel chuckled. That's the business. Several guests nodded politely, but Sasha understood something Roman still did not. The evening had already crossed a line, not because of the financial discussion, because of what had happened earlier. Roman's careless remarks about his wife still hung in the room like an unfinished sentence. Eleanor had heard them. So had the bank officers. And in professional environments, character often matters more than people expect. William turned toward Eleanor. Before we continue discussing numbers, he said politely, I'd like to thank NorthBridge again for supporting our developments over the years. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. NorthBridge supports projects that demonstrate stability. Then she looked directly across the table. Not at William, not at Roman, at Sasha. The room had grown quiet again. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Eleanor's voice softened slightly. Sasha, she said. The name carried easily across the table. Several people looked confused. Roman blinked. Eleanor's eyes remained steady. My daughter, she added gently. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt almost physical. Roman turned slowly toward Sasha. His expression changed as the meaning of Eleanor's words began to settle. Your daughter Daniel stared across the table. William Whitaker's face lost color. Caroline Whitaker froze completely. Sasha Northrop met her mother's gaze calmly. Then she nodded once. Yes, one word. Quiet, certain, and suddenly the entire structure of the evening shifted, because the Whitaker family had just discovered something they had never imagined. The quiet woman they had spent 3 years underestimating, the woman Roman had publicly called nobody, was the daughter of Eleanor Northrop, the founder and majority owner of NorthBridge Federal Bank, the same bank currently holding hundreds of millions of dollars in Whitaker development loans. No one laughed now, no one spoke. Because power rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it simply reveals its name. Silence settled over the dining room with a weight that no one could immediately escape. It was not the polite silence that sometimes followed complicated financial discussions. This was something else. The kind of silence that appears when a room suddenly understands that the structure of its assumptions has just collapsed. Roman Whitaker was the first person to move. Slowly, he turned toward Sasha, studying her face as if he were seeing it for the first time. "Your mother?" He began, his voice uncertain. Runs NorthBridge. Sasha did not rush to answer. Her posture remained composed, her hands resting calmly near the edge of the table. Then she said quietly, "Yes." Roman blinked. The single word carried more weight than any explanation. Across the table, Daniel Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence replaced with visible confusion. "You're serious," he said. Sasha looked at him. "I am." William Whitaker remained very still. For decades, he had navigated complicated negotiations, economic downturns, and volatile real estate markets. But this moment was different. Because it was not a financial calculation, it was a realization. He had spent years working with NorthBridge Federal Bank, negotiating loans, refinancing projects, maintaining what he believed was a stable professional relationship. And yet, the daughter of the bank's founder had been sitting inside his family for 3 years. Unnoticed, unacknowledged, misunderstood. Caroline Whitaker's face had gone pale. She stared at Sasha with a mixture of disbelief and something deeper recognition of past mistakes. The quiet corrections, the subtle criticisms. Every moment she had treated Sasha as socially inferior now echoed through the room with uncomfortable clarity. Meanwhile, Eleanor Northrop had not moved. Her posture remained as calm as it had been when she entered the room. She allowed the silence to settle naturally before speaking again. "This information was not relevant to our professional relationship," she said evenly. Her voice was neither defensive nor apologetic, simply factual. Roman looked between Sasha and Eleanor. "But you never said anything." Sasha met his eyes. "You never asked." Daniel let out a short breath. "You're telling me you've been married into this family for 3 years and never mentioned that your mother owns the bank financing half our developments?" Sasha tilted her head slightly. "I never discussed my family's business in your company meetings." Daniel laughed, once an awkward, disbelieving sound. "That's one way to put it." William finally spoke. His voice had regained some of its usual steadiness. "Miss Northrop," he said carefully to Eleanor, "we had no idea about this connection." Eleanor nodded slightly. "I understand." There was no accusation in her tone, but the atmosphere in the room remained tense, because everyone present remembered the earlier part of the evening. Roman's laughter, his careless remarks, "My wife, she's nobody." The words had seemed harmless when he said them. Now they hung in the air like evidence. Eleanor glanced briefly toward Sasha again. There was a quiet question in her eyes. Not spoken, but clear. "Are you comfortable?" Sasha gave the smallest nod. The professional boundary remained intact. Eleanor returned her attention to the table. "As I mentioned earlier," she said calmly, "NorthBridge is currently conducting a routine review of several large commercial lending exposures." Her tone remained strictly professional. The shift back to business was deliberate, but no one in the room could ignore the new context. William folded his hands together. "Of course," he said. Eleanor gestured lightly toward one of the loan officers. "Mr. Chen has brought the current exposure summary for Whitaker Commercial Holdings." The banker opened a slim portfolio and placed several documents on the table. The pages displayed precise financial data: loan amounts, project timelines, risk evaluations. Roman stared at the numbers. He had reviewed similar reports before. But tonight they felt different, because the person overseeing the bank's final decisions was now sitting directly across from him. And that person had just watched him publicly humiliate her daughter. Daniel leaned forward. "So what exactly does review mean?" he asked. Mr. Chen answered calmly. "It means we evaluate the stability of ongoing projects and determine whether current lending structures remain appropriate." Daniel frowned. But we've already provided all the documentation. That is correct, Mr. Chen said. But reviews also consider broader market conditions and project performance indicators. Roman rubbed his temples slightly. So nothing has changed yet. Eleanor answered that question herself. Nothing has changed, she said. Then she added something that caused several people at the table to shift uneasily. But reviews can lead to adjustments. The words were quiet, but unmistakable. William Whitaker nodded slowly. We understand. He understood more than the others, because after decades in real estate finance, William knew exactly how banks operated. They rarely retaliated. They did not punish. They simply reassessed. And reassessment could quietly reshape the future of entire companies. Across the table, Sasha remained silent. She had not intervened. She had not defended herself. She had not reminded anyone of Roman's earlier remarks. Because the truth had already revealed itself. Daniel leaned back again, studying Sasha with new curiosity. So you just sat there all these years, he said, letting us think you were... What exactly? Sasha looked at him calmly. Your assumptions were never my responsibility. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, because there was nothing to argue with. Meanwhile, Roman still seemed to be processing the moment. He looked at Sasha again. You could have told me, he said quietly. Sasha considered that statement. I chose not to. Roman swallowed. Why? Sasha's answer was simple. I wanted to see how people behave when they think status protects them. The sentence settled heavily across the table, because everyone present understood what she meant. Behavior reveals character. And earlier that evening, Roman Whitaker had revealed his. The dinner continued after that, but the atmosphere had permanently changed. What had begun as a confident demonstration of Whitaker influence had become something else entirely. A quiet confrontation with truth. And although the conversation eventually returned to financial documentation and loan structures, every person in the room understood one thing clearly. The balance of power had shifted, not through anger, not through threats, but through the simple revelation of who Sasha Northrop truly was. After the revelation, the rest of the dinner unfolded with a strange, restrained politeness. Conversations resumed. Documents were reviewed. Questions were asked. But something fundamental in the room had changed. Earlier in the evening, the Whitaker family had spoken with the easy authority of people accustomed to controlling negotiations. Now, every word felt more measured, more cautious, because the professional discussion about refinancing had become intertwined with a personal realization none of them had expected. William Whitaker understood the shift immediately. He had spent too many years in financial negotiations to miss it. The bank representatives were still courteous, still professional, but the room now carried the quiet gravity of a real evaluation. Not the comfortable assumption of approval the Whitakers had expected. Meanwhile, Sasha Northrop remained almost completely silent. She did not interrupt the discussion. She did not comment on the financial documents. She simply listened. Roman, sitting beside her, had not fully recovered his earlier confidence. His posture was tense now. His mind replayed the moment from earlier in the evening again and again. My wife, she's nobody. At the time, he had spoken casually, almost playfully. But now, those words felt different. Because the person he had humiliated in front of business partners was not only his wife. She was the daughter of the woman who owned the bank, holding hundreds of millions of dollars in Whitaker loans. Roman glanced at Sasha once. She did not look back. Across the table, Eleanor Northrop reviewed the financial summary placed before her. She read every line carefully. Loan structures, interest adjustments, market projections. Everything was exactly as she had seen earlier in the bank's internal review. Nothing about the numbers themselves had changed tonight, but Eleanor had never believed that numbers existed independently from behavior. Institutions lend money to companies, but they also lend trust to people. And people reveal themselves in moments when they believe their status protects them. She closed the folder calmly. NorthBridge will continue its review of the Westgate exposure, she said. William nodded respectfully. That is understandable. Eleanor's voice remained steady. This review is part of a broader compliance process affecting several large developments. The statement was technically accurate. NorthBridge had indeed been reviewing multiple projects. But the emphasis on compliance carried additional meaning. Banks often use compliance reviews as a way to slow decisions, to reassess risks, to examine relationships more carefully. Daniel Whitaker leaned forward. How long does a review like that usually take, he asked. One of the loan officers answered. It depends on the complexity of the project. Daniel frowned. Westgate isn't complicated. Eleanor looked at him calmly. Large commercial developments are always complex. Daniel leaned back again. He did not argue. William spoke next. We appreciate the bank's diligence, he said carefully. His tone was respectful, but his mind was already calculating. Whitaker Commercial Holdings had several refinancing deadlines approaching. If NorthBridge delayed its approval, the company might be forced to restructure financing through other institutions. That was possible, but difficult, because NorthBridge currently held the largest share of the company's exposure. Eleanor continued. Our team will likely request updated documentation within the next 2 weeks. Roman nodded quickly. We'll provide anything necessary. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. I'm sure you will. The discussion moved through additional financial details, projected occupancy, retail lease negotiations, hotel management contracts. All of it sounded professional, technical, controlled. But beneath every exchange lingered the memory of the earlier humiliation. Roman knew it. Daniel knew it. William certainly knew it. Because character had already entered the negotiation. Eventually, the formal discussion ended. Dessert was served, but no one seemed particularly interested in it. Guests began preparing to leave. William stood first, shaking hands with the NorthBridge executives. Thank you again for coming, he said. Eleanor accepted the gesture politely. We appreciate the opportunity to discuss the project. Roman rose next. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. I hope you understand, he began awkwardly, that earlier this evening, Eleanor raised a hand slightly, stopping him. This is a professional environment, Mr. Whitaker. Her tone remained calm. There is no need to revisit personal remarks. The sentence was polite, but final. Roman felt his throat tighten slightly. He nodded. Of course. Across the room, Sasha stood quietly beside her chair. For the first time that evening, Eleanor approached her directly. The two women spoke quietly enough that most of the room could not hear. You handled that with composure, Eleanor said. Sasha's expression remained calm. You taught me to. Eleanor studied her daughter carefully. Are you all right? Sasha nodded. Yes. Eleanor did not press further. She trusted Sasha's judgment. After a brief pause, she added one final sentence. Professional reviews take time. Sasha understood the meaning behind the words. Her mother was not promising punishment. She was describing process. Banks rarely act emotionally. They act systematically. Thank you, Sasha said. Eleanor nodded once. Then she returned to the other NorthBridge executives and prepared to leave. Within minutes, the private dining room began to empty. Legal advisors departed. Consultants gathered their documents. The quiet staff cleared glasses and folded table linens. Soon, only the Whitaker family remained. The atmosphere felt heavier now. Daniel was the first to break the silence. Well, he muttered, that was unexpected. Roman did not answer. He was still staring at the door through which Eleanor had exited. Caroline Whitaker sat very still. Her thoughts had returned repeatedly to every small criticism she had directed at Sasha over the past 3 years. Dress choices, social etiquette, status. The realization made her deeply uncomfortable. William Whitaker remained standing near the table. His mind worked through financial scenarios rapidly. If NorthBridge delayed refinancing approval, if lenders began questioning Whitaker's stability, if market confidence weakened. He turned slowly towards Sasha. His voice was calm, but noticeably more respectful than it had ever been before. "Sasha," he said. She looked at him. "I believe there are many things about our family we should discuss." Sasha considered his words for a moment. Then she answered quietly, "Yes." But her tone made something clear. Those conversations would not change what had already been revealed. Because once respect is broken in public rebuilding, it is rarely simple. And the Whitaker family had just begun discovering how fragile their assumptions had been. The ride home from the Metropolitan Business Club was unusually quiet. Chicago's late-night traffic moved slowly across the river bridges, headlights reflecting in long streaks across the dark water. Normally, Roman Whitaker enjoyed driving through the city at night. The skyline reminded him of the buildings his family had helped create, structures that represented decades of ambition and financial success. Tonight, the view felt different. Sasha sat beside him in the passenger seat, looking out the window without speaking. Her posture remained calm, composed almost exactly the same as it had been at the dinner table. Roman gripped the steering wheel more tightly than usual. He had replayed the evening in his mind several times already. The laughter, his careless words, "My wife, she's nobody." And then Sasha Northrop speaking across the table. "My daughter." The memory felt heavier every time it returned. Roman cleared his throat. "Sasha." She turned slightly. "Yes." Roman hesitated before continuing. "You never told me." Her answer came without hesitation. "You never asked." Roman exhaled slowly. "That's not the same thing." Sasha watched him carefully. "For 3 years," Roman continued, "you let my family believe you came from nothing." Sasha did not react to the phrasing. "I never described my family that way." Roman shook his head. "You knew what we assumed." "Yes." Roman's frustration rose slightly. "So, why didn't you correct us?" Sasha turned her eyes back toward the window. "Because the question deserved an honest answer. I wanted to understand the people I married into." Roman frowned. "You think you understand us now?" Sasha considered that. "I understand enough." Roman felt something shift in his chest. The calmness in Sasha's voice unsettled him more than anger would have. He had expected an argument, accusations, something emotional. Instead, Sasha remained exactly as she had been at dinner, quiet, observant, controlled. Roman spoke again. "You embarrassed my family tonight." Sasha turned back toward him slowly. "I embarrassed your family." Roman's jaw tightened. "You could have said something before that dinner." Sasha met his eyes. "You had many opportunities to treat me with respect long before tonight." Roman did not respond. Because he remembered those moments now. Small ones, Daniel's jokes, Caroline's corrections, and his own laughter. The elevator ride to their condominium was equally silent. When they stepped inside the apartment, Sasha removed her coat calmly and placed it on the rack near the door. Roman remained standing in the center of the room. "What happens now?" he asked. Sasha walked toward the kitchen. She poured a glass of water and drank slowly before answering. "That depends." "On what? On whether tonight was surprising to you," Sasha said quietly. Roman stared at her. Of course it was surprising. Sasha studied him. Was my family surprising, or was it the consequences? Roman opened his mouth to reply, but stopped, because he realized something uncomfortable. The revelation itself had shocked him. But the deeper discomfort came from something else. The realization that his words earlier that evening now carried weight he had never intended. He walked closer. "Sasha, I didn't mean what I said." Sasha set the glass down. "I believe you meant exactly what you believed in that moment." Roman shook his head. "I was joking." "You were comfortable," Sasha corrected gently. Roman ran a hand through his hair. You're my wife. Yes. So this affects both of us. Sasha held his gaze. That is true. Roman waited. But Sasha did not continue. Instead, she walked toward the small desk near the living room window. The leather notebook rested there. Roman recognized it immediately. You're writing again. Sasha opened the notebook and turned to a fresh page. Yes. Roman's frustration returned. What are you writing about? Sasha's pen moved slowly across the paper. Tonight. Roman laughed bitterly. Great. So I'll be another entry. Sasha closed the notebook. You already are. Roman stared at her. For the first time since the dinner, he noticed something deeper beneath Sasha's calm demeanor. Distance. Not anger. Not revenge. Something quieter. Final. Roman spoke again. Look, whatever happened tonight, we can fix it. Sasha's expression did not change. Fix what our relationship. Sasha walked toward the window. The Chicago skyline stretched across the dark river, glowing with quiet power. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she spoke softly. Roman relationships are not damaged by single moments. Roman waited. They are revealed by them. Roman felt his chest tighten again. So what are you saying? Sasha turned back toward him. I'm saying that tonight showed me something important. Roman's voice dropped slightly. What Sasha answered simply. How comfortable you are humiliating someone when you believe they have no power. Roman looked away. That's not fair. It's accurate. Roman's frustration flared again. You think I'm the only one who did that tonight? Sasha shook her head. No. Roman blinked. My mother? Yes. My brother? Yes. Roman swallowed. My father. Sasha paused before answering. Your father watched. The sentence landed quietly. Roman sat down heavily on the sofa. For the first time that evening, he looked exhausted. What do you want from me? He asked. Sasha did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward the desk again and opened a thin folder resting beside the notebook. Roman frowned. What is that? Sasha removed a document. Her voice remained calm. My attorney prepared this earlier this week. Roman stared at the paper. Your attorney, Sasha, placed the document on the table between them. It was a formal legal filing. Roman's eyes moved across the page slowly. Then he froze. Divorce? Sasha nodded. Yes. Roman looked up sharply. You were planning this before tonight, Sasha answered honestly. I was considering it. Roman stood abruptly. So this whole thing, this was not about revenge. Sasha interrupted quietly. Roman's breathing had grown uneven. Then what is it about? Sasha met his eyes. Clarity. Roman stared at the document again. In the bank, Sasha shook her head. My mother runs a bank, Roman. So banks follow procedures. Roman looked back at her. You're telling me this has nothing to do with Whitaker loans? Sasha's voice remained steady. My mother does not punish clients. Roman waited. But she does review risk carefully. Roman sank back into the chair. For the first time, he truly understood something. The Whitaker family's financial future was now being examined by the institution controlled by Sasha's family. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but through a process that could quietly reshape everything. Sasha gathered the documents calmly. I will be staying elsewhere for a while, she said. Roman did not stop her, because the silence between them had already answered the only question that mattered. Some damage cannot be undone, not with apologies, not with explanations, and certainly not after the truth has already revealed itself. The morning after the dinner felt strangely ordinary. Chicago woke as it always did. Commuters crossing bridges, trains echoing through elevated tracks, sunlight reflecting off glass towers along the river. The city carried on with its routines, unaware that inside a quiet condominium overlooking the water, a marriage had already ended. Roman Whitaker had barely slept. The divorce papers Sasha left on the table remained exactly where she had placed them. He had read them 3 times during the night, hoping each time that some detail might change. It never did. Across the city, Sasha Northrop was already awake. She had left the condominium shortly before dawn, taking only a small suitcase and the leather notebook she had carried for months. Her driver waited quietly outside the building, and within minutes they were moving through the quiet streets toward a different part of the city. Not toward her mother's home. Sasha had no intention of turning the situation into a family confrontation. Instead, she checked into a quiet hotel overlooking Lake Michigan, a place often used by visiting executives who preferred privacy. From the outside, nothing about her arrival appeared dramatic. She signed the registration calmly, requested a long-term suite, and carried her suitcase upstairs. Because Sasha had never believed that leaving a marriage required spectacle. Sometimes dignity simply meant walking away. Meanwhile, inside Whitaker Commercial Holdings, the effects of the previous night were beginning to surface. William Whitaker arrived at the office earlier than usual. He had spent most of the night reviewing financial projections, not because anything had changed overnight, but because uncertainty had entered the equation. And uncertainty in real estate financing could grow quickly. Daniel arrived an hour later, looking equally tired. "Well," Daniel muttered as he dropped his briefcase on the desk, "that dinner went well." William didn't respond immediately. He was reviewing an email on his laptop. "What now?" Daniel asked. William turned the screen slightly. "It appears NorthBridge has already scheduled a follow-up review meeting." Daniel frowned. That was fast. "Yes." William leaned back in his chair. Banks move quickly when exposure is large. Daniel paced across the office. "You don't think this has anything to do with Sasha, do you?" William considered the question carefully. "Banks do not make decisions based on personal matters." Daniel scoffed. "You really believe that?" William's voice remained calm. "I believe Eleanor Northrop has spent 30 years building a disciplined institution." Daniel folded his arms. "So what are you saying I'm saying?" William replied quietly, "that our situation is now under scrutiny." Daniel exhaled sharply, all because Roman couldn't keep his mouth shut. Neither of them said anything for several seconds, because both men understood something uncomfortable. The problem was not Sasha's identity. The problem was what the Whitaker family had revealed about themselves. Meanwhile, across the city, Sasha sat at a desk near the large window of her hotel suite. Her leather notebook rested open in front of her. She read through the earlier entries slowly. Dates, observations, conversations, small moments she had recorded without judgment. Caroline correcting her dress, Daniel mocking her work, Roman laughing at dinner parties. The final entry from the previous night remained at the bottom of the page. "Roman Whitaker, my wife, she's nobody." Sasha closed the notebook, not because the words no longer mattered, but because they had already served their purpose. Her phone rang softly. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Eleanor Northrop. Sasha answered. "Good morning." Her mother's voice was calm. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine." There was a brief pause. "Roman, I left." Eleanor did not sound surprised. "I expected you might." Sasha walked toward the window. The lake stretched across the horizon, calm under the morning light. "The bank will continue its review," Eleanor said. "I know. Nothing about that process will be personal. I understand." Another pause followed. Then Eleanor added something more personal. "You handled last night with restraint." Sasha smiled faintly. "You raised me too?" Eleanor's voice softened slightly. "You are not obligated to remain where you are not respected." "I know." Sasha ended the call a few minutes later. The rest of the morning passed quietly. She met briefly with her attorney to finalize the filing of the divorce documents. There were no dramatic arguments, no courtroom confrontations. Roman had not contested the filing. In fact, he had barely spoken to her since she left. Perhaps he understood that the situation had moved beyond apologies. Or perhaps he simply realized that respect once lost rarely returns easily. Weeks passed. NorthBridge Federal Bank completed its review of Whitaker Commercial Holdings loan exposure. The results were predictable, not punitive, not emotional, simply cautious. Refinancing timelines were extended. Certain loan conditions were tightened. Additional documentation was required. None of the decisions destroyed the Whitaker Company, but they changed its momentum. Growth slowed. New projects were delayed. The Whitaker empire did not collapse, but it no longer expanded with the same confidence, and everyone in Chicago's financial circles quietly understood why. Meanwhile, Sasha Northrop returned to her normal routines. She continued her research work, spent occasional afternoons visiting her mother's office, and slowly rebuilt a life that required no explanation. Months later, she walked along the Riverwalk near downtown Chicago. The same skyline stretched above her, the same buildings Roman had once proudly pointed out. But now, the city looked different. Not because anything had changed, because Sasha no longer needed to prove she belonged within it. Power had never been the point. Respect had. And respect, unlike wealth or reputation, could not be inherited or borrowed. It had to be shown. The Whitaker family had learned that lesson too late. But Sasha Northrop had learned something more important. Silence can reveal truth more clearly than confrontation. And walking away with dignity is sometimes the strongest answer anyone can give. In the end, this story was never really about money. It wasn't about banks, real estate empires, or powerful family names. Those things simply created the stage. What truly shaped the story were the quiet moments when people believed no one important was watching. Moments when respect is withheld, when someone feels safe enough to humiliate another person, because they believe status protects them. Roman Whitaker believed that. His family believed it too. But dignity does not depend on status, and power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly at the table, listening, waiting, observing. Sasha Northrop never raised her voice. She never tried to embarrass anyone in return. She simply allowed people to reveal who they were. And when the truth appeared clearly enough, she chose to walk away. Not with anger, but with clarity. If you've ever watched someone be underestimated, or seen the moment when quiet strength changes everything, take a moment and share where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Stories like this travel far, and every place adds its own perspective. And if you believe dignity matters more than titles, wealth, or reputation, you're welcome to stay with this channel for more stories like this one. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never need to prove it.